Nurse Alina Marsh had worked the overnight shift at St. Aldrich's Memorial for 6 years. And in that time she had developed a rule she never spoke aloud to her colleagues. She did not let anyone die alone. Not because a hospital policy required it, no policy did, but because of something that had happened to her own mother 11 years earlier. In a different hospital, in a different city. When Alina had been 17 and had watched her mother's final hours pass in a room where the nurses came and went on schedule and nobody sat still long enough to hold her hand until the very end. When Alina herself had finally understood that some kinds of care cannot be charted or billed, she had become a nurse, in part, to make sure that never happened to someone else, while she had the power to prevent it. The man in room 412 had been admitted 9 days earlier with advanced heart failure, no visitors, and an emergency contact field on his intake form that read, simply unknown. His name was Walter Hale. He was 74 years old, and in 9 days, not a single person had come to see him. The hospital's social worker had made calls an old employer. A neighbor listed in an outdated address book found in his belongings, but nothing had produced a visitor. And the assumption, unspoken, but present in the way the staff discussed his case, was that Walter Hale had simply outlived or outlasted whatever family he'd once had. Alina did not know, when she was assigned to his case on a Tuesday night, that this assumption was wrong in a way. It would matter enormously by the following weekend. What she knew was that he was frightened in the specific, contained way of a man who has spent decades not letting anyone see him frightened, and that when she sat with him during her rounds, 5 extra minutes here, 10 there, the time she made up by moving faster through paperwork she used to take breaks to finish, his breathing eased in a way the machines could measure but not explain. On the 3rd night, he told her, in a voice thinned by illness, but still carrying the shape of the man he'd once been, that he'd worked 40 years as a machinist, that he'd been married once, a long time ago, and that he had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades, because of a mistake he'd made that he described only as the worst thing I ever did to someone who trusted me and refused to elaborate. Further, no matter how gently, Alina asked, before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Alina Marsh had been born Alina Hale and had changed her surname at 22, quietly, without ceremony. The same year she finished nursing school, and the same year she stopped answering her father's letters entirely. The mistake Walter would not name to her sitting in that hospital bed 9 days from the end of his life was one Alina knew in exhaustive, permanent detail, because she had lived on the other side of it, a father who chose. During the hardest year of his own life, laid off, drinking, married to a woman who was already halfway out the door, to disappear rather than fight for the family that needed him to stay. He had left when Alina was 12. He had sent money sporadically for 2 years, and then not at all. He had written letters over the following decade that arrived less and less often, each one a little more apologetic and a little less specific about what exactly he was sorry for, until Alina, in her early 20s, exhausted by the particular grief of grieving someone who was still alive, had stopped opening them. She had not recognized him at first. Illness does what illness does to a face. The man in room 412 was gaunt, gray, diminished in 100 small ways from whatever photograph Alina still carried at the edges of her memory. And 22 years is a long time for a face to change. It was not until the 4th night when he mentioned, almost incidentally, that his daughter's name had been Alina and that she'd have been about 34 now, that something in Alina's chest went cold, and still in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital's climate control. She did not tell him. She went into the supply closet at the end of the hall and stood there for 11 minutes. Long enough that a colleague came looking for her, and when she came out, she went back to room 412 and continued doing exactly what she had been doing. Because whatever this was, whatever grief or fury or disbelief was moving through her, she had made a rule about not letting people die alone. And Walter Hale did not yet know he was dying to the man who had decades ago. made the same choice to leave rather than stay. For the next 5 nights, Alina sat with her father without telling him who she was, she told herself. At first, that she was gathering information, deciding what to do, protecting herself from a reckoning she wasn't ready for. But as the nights passed, what she was actually doing was something closer to a private, unbearable kind of grace, sitting beside the man who had abandoned her, holding his hand through the worst hours of the night, adjusting his pillows, listening to him describe, without knowing his listener's identity, the daughter he'd failed and the 20 years of shame that had kept him from ever trying hard enough to find her and make it right. He told Alina, his nurse, not knowing she was also his daughter, that the hardest part of dying alone was not the loneliness itself, but the certainty that he had earned it. That whatever this ending looked like was simply the balance coming due on a debt he'd never had the courage to pay, while he could still do something about it. Alina sat with that, night after night, saying almost nothing, because she did not trust her own voice not to break in a way that would reveal everything before she was ready. On the 7th night, his condition worsened sharply, the attending physician told Alina in the hallway. In the flat clinical language doctors use to protect themselves from the weight of what they're saying, that Walter Hale likely had days left, not weeks, and that the social worker's efforts to locate family had produced nothing further. Alina said nothing. She went back into the room and sat down beside the bed and took her father's hand, the way she had every night that week, and for the first time let herself simply feel the whole shape of what she was holding. A man dying without anyone who loved him in the room, except that someone who loved him in the wrecked, complicated way children love parents who failed them, was sitting 3 feet away and hadn't said a word. Walter, eyes closed, weak, said, without opening them, "You're good at this. Sitting with people. Somebody raised you right, wherever they are," Lena said, so quietly she barely heard herself say it. "You did." For a while, Walter's eyes opened. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked. Past the illness and the exhaustion, in 22 years of a face changing in his memory into someone he could no longer picture clearly. And something in his face collapsed inward, not with shock exactly, but with a recognition that had clearly been circling somewhere beneath the surface of the last 5 nights without ever quite landing, he said. "Alina," she said. "Yes." He said nothing for a long time. Then he said in a voice that had gone entirely unsteady, "You've been sitting with me every night." "You knew. You've known, and you've sat here anyway," Lena said. "I made a promise a long time ago that I wouldn't let anyone die alone if I could help it. I didn't know how to make an exception for you. I still don't." Walter began to cry, the specific, undefended crying of a man who has spent a lifetime believing he doesn't deserve comfort and is receiving it anyway. He said, "I don't understand how you could do this. Sit here, take care of me. After everything," Lena said, "I don't fully understand it either. I've been asking myself every night this week." Hey. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I've spent 20 years being angry at you for leaving. And I think some part of me needed to find out what it would feel like to be the one who stayed, even once, even now, even for you." He said, "I have wanted to find you for so many years. I wrote so many letters. I didn't know how to say the thing that actually needed saying, so I kept writing around it instead. And eventually you stopped writing back, and I told myself I deserved that. And I let it become an excuse to stop trying," Lena said. "What's the thing that actually needed saying?" Walter looked at her and said finally, plainly, without the shame-softened language of his old letters, "I was scared and selfish. And I chose leaving because it was easier than staying and fixing what I'd broken. That's not an excuse. That's just the truth. And you deserved the truth 22 years ago. And I'm sorry it took a hospital bed for me to finally say it." Lena did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right. And she had spent too many years learning to stop pretending things were fine when they weren't. What she held his hand. And she stayed. And something in the room shifted from the particular loneliness of 9 unvisited days into something that had, for the first time, another person fully present inside it. On the 9th night, the night the doctors had quietly told Elena's supervisor might be his last, Walter's estranged sister, tracked down finally through an old employment record the social worker had kept pursuing independent of Elena's silence, arrived at the hospital with her adult son. Having heard, through a chain of calls, that Walter was dying and unclaimed, they walked into room 412, expecting to find a stranger's nurse attending a man neither of them had spoken to in 15 years, and found instead Elena sitting beside the bed. Holding his hand, her face streaked but composed, in the specific way of someone who has been crying quietly for hours, without letting it stop her from doing what she came to do. Walter's sister, Margaret, stopped in the doorway. She looked at Elena's face for a long moment, something tugging at a memory she couldn't immediately place, and then she said, slowly, disbelieving, "Elena."
"Little Elena?"
Elena said, "Hello, Aunt Margaret." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. She said, "You're his nurse. You've been—" She looked between Elena and her brother, understanding arriving all at once. "You've known this whole time?" Elena said, "Since the fourth night," Margaret said. "And you stayed," Elena said. "I stayed." Walter, weak from the bed, said, "She stayed when I gave her every reason not to." Margaret crossed the room and took her brother's other hand. And for the first time in 15 years, the Hale family occupied the same room without anyone having to be found, chased down, or convinced, because Elena, without telling anyone what it was costing her, had already done the hardest part of that work simply by refusing to leave. Walter Hale died 4 days later, in the early morning, with his sister on one side of the bed and his daughter on the other, holding both his hands in a room that was, for the first time in 9 days, and arguably for the first time in over 2 decades, entirely and unmistakably not lonely. Before the end, in one of his last clear conversations, he asked Elena what had made her become a nurse in the first place. She told him about her mother's final hours, the empty room, the rule she'd made afterward that she'd never told anyone about. She said, "I think I built my whole life around not letting what happened to her happen to anyone else. I didn't know it would end up including you," Walter said. "I'm glad it did. I don't think I deserved it, but I'm glad it did," Elena said. "Maybe deserving isn't really the point. Maybe the point is that somebody has to choose to stay, and it might as well be someone who knows exactly how much it costs." At the funeral, small, quiet, attended only by Margaret, her son, a handful of Walter's old co-workers, and Elena. Standing at the front, in a plain dark coat, no one spoke about forgiveness in any grand or final way, because Elena herself was still working out in the months that followed what forgiveness for her father actually meant, and how much of it she was capable of extending. But she kept a small note in her uniform pocket for months afterward, one Walter had dictated to her on his 8th night, in handwriting that was hers because his hands had grown too weak to hold a pen. That read simply, "Thank you for staying when you didn't have to. I know now what that costs. I'm sorry I never gave you the same. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, is there someone in your life you're still learning how to forgive? One small choice at a time?